Welcome back, everyone, to Worlds Beyond with Cam and Ron. Say hi, Cam.
Hey, happy Halloween, everyone.
Yes, happy Halloween. We are, in fact, recording on Halloween, and this is going to be the second of our two sort of Halloween deep dives into classic Universal monsters and the various adaptations that have happened over the years. We had hoped to do one or two more Halloween specials, if you will, before this season was over, but unfortunately a huge nor'easter here in the Boston area hit us, and I had a power outage for a couple of days, so that got in the way of our schedule. But nevertheless, we're ready to go, and this episode we are going to discuss first Frankenstein and some key Frankenstein films, and then we will switch gears and do the Wolfman. And so without further ado, tee this up for you, Cam. We'll start with 1931's Universal Frankenstein, and what is your reaction?
Well, I loved this one, and I think you made a point when we talked about Dracula that Frankenstein compared to the original 1931 Dracula is just a huge step forward.
Improvement, yeah.
In terms of the structure of the plot and the dialogue. I loved the atmosphere of this one. It opens up with that creepy funeral in the foggy cemetery, and then not Dracula, Frankenstein and his kooky assistant, I guess it's Igor, are hiding behind the hills there, and then they come out and they're digging the bodies, and you have the people hanging on from the nooses in the background. It's just really creepy. And then the way the plot unfolds just seems a lot more natural than Dracula, whereas Dracula kind of has this one-part, two-part separation of first year. It tells the story of Renfield, and then it kind of moves in. This feels a lot more consistent with following a cast of characters all the way through.
Right.
And I just think that the characters are much more alive and human. Frankenstein especially, obviously, his relationship with his wife and the other professors from his college there just seems a lot more natural to me than anything that was in Dracula, for sure. And then once you finally get to all of the great mad scientist laboratory aesthetic stuff, where with all those electricity zapping and it's totally nonsense.
That like set the standard for those for
totally. And
sci-fi and horror movies to come.
Right, absolutely. And that to me is total Halloween. All that goofy mad scientist equipment and raising the body up to the moon that is all just great classic Halloween stuff. So for me, it exemplifies that Halloween atmosphere and has a great plot and good characters. Oh, I haven't even talked about the monster yet. Obviously, the monster is fantastic. The performance is great. And who is that? Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
And he does a great job. And especially at the end when he's trapped in that burning building and he's like screaming and running around everywhere. That is just
slapping on the railing.
That is just like really haunting. And then the end where you watch the burning windmill kind of come down. I think it's a great cap to that whole saga. So yeah, overall, I think as much as I love 1931 Dracula and respect it, this is just much more solid of a movie.
Yeah, totally agree there. It was like night and day watching Frankenstein 32 or 31 after the original Dracula. And again, echo a lot of the things that you mentioned. I was surprised that they got into the grave robbing and body parts acquisition, if you will, stuff in the 1931 movie. I thought they wouldn't have gone there as deeply and for that time in movies. Yeah, the laboratory stuff was again tremendous. Overall, I think I echo a lot of what you said, so it doesn't probably bear repeating. In the character of Frankenstein and his obsession, and then his change of heart after he puts the creature together, and then just sort of pushes it aside and abandons it and like kind of walks away. And I don't remember did he think it was dead or something?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Okay. He kind of gets a free pass, which I thought was really strange for being sort of responsible for all this. And then they go through the whole thing. I mean, obviously he does sort of step up and track down the creature and face off with him in the windmill, but I thought he was going to die, but then he survived. And I just thought it was really strange how they carried him back to the Frankenstein estate. And then the next morning, all the servants come by with the wine and wake him up. And the dad comes out and he's like, oh, no, he's fine in there with his fiance and he doesn't need the wine. And I just thought it was all like, wow, this guy kind of like...
Yeah, he got away with it.
Really got off the hook. But yeah, definitely very enjoyable, classic movie. Obviously, you have to have some patience to watch these older horror movies, but if you can, this is one of the ones that really sort of moves along.
Yeah, and with that, do you want to start with 58's Curse? Curse of Frankenstein?
Yeah, so Curse of Frankenstein. Now we're back to Hammer horror, and I really love this one. I think it's got a great build-up, a great background. It builds up the entire sort of... The real character study of Frankenstein comes through in this, and the growing obsession over time. And it really gets into how he just turns slowly. He really does become... And that's the juxtaposition about what I just talked about with Frankenstein 31, is Frankenstein really turns into a villain in this story, and he is the villain of the story way more so than the monster. I mean, in both I think he is, but he's treated that way. I thought Christopher Lee was tremendous as the monster. The stylistic difference in terms of how they did it. This was one of the first times Hammer got into the really red blood. When Frankenstein's assistant shoots him in the eye. And a lot of that, again, they stepped it up too in terms of the laboratory effects and everything else. The grave robbing, like showing the eye and the hand, and they really, for its time at least, they sort of stepped up the shock and gore factor with this. But just the way that Frankenstein just descended into, I guess, madness, and just becoming this villainous character that was just so obsessed. And even at the end, he never really saw the error in his ways. He still was committed to doing that. And the way he took advantage of the servant girl, and then he sort of like fed her, not fed her literally, but to the creature, and was just not above just killing anyone. The way he killed that professor to get his brain. And then it showed how the damage to the brain really caused the corruption in the creature and what made it into such a violent animal. We all, as kids growing up, thought Frankenstein was the name of the monster, not the person. And I think, in addition to all the things that I love about Hammer, that just the sets, the Victorian costume, the score by James Bernard. Terence Fisher directs this one. He directed the Dracula. I think he directs all the best Hammer horrors of that early period. So with all that, but this really, I think, more than any of the three movies that we're going to talk about, has Frankenstein come through as really the villain, and he really should be seen as the villain, and it moved along really well. I didn't feel like there was the dip in this one in terms of pacing or getting into too much exposition.
It's funny that you bring up exposition, because I do think it works a lot better in this movie than it did in Dracula. And I think just the plot and the themes lend themselves really well to the Hammer style, especially with the kind of debates and banter between the professors and all that kind of scholarly academic people. And it just works really well with their British accents and just that atmosphere. And yeah, I think the biggest thing that stands out to me is it just flows a lot better than Dracula. And I think that is just because the kind of academic nature of it works a little bit better for the kind of British Hammer style. But yeah, no, I think we both really liked both of these. Right. So I think this last one is going to be the fun one, because we both have plenty of stuff to say about it, which is Kenneth Branagh's 1994 Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was, to me, totally trying to kind of copy the success of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula film, but I don't think Kenneth Branagh was the right person to go with if that's what they were going for, because it's not a horror movie. It's really just like a period drama film with some sci-fi elements. And I know you didn't really care for it. It actually worked for me. I do understand a lot of your complaints and agree with them, but I can kind of look past them. I really liked the kind of Shakespearean, almost like Harry Potter mystical, magical atmosphere that they were doing, even though it wasn't creepy or even Halloween themed in any way. And I think that's probably the biggest misfire, is that they totally didn't lean into any of the horror elements like at all. It was just a straight drama. And I guess from what I've read, it sticks very closely to the original story, but I think having Kenneth Branagh there really pushed it over the edge into a historical drama film, and it just gets kind of melodramatic and silly. But that being said, I appreciated it because it was just so different from the previous ones.
Right.
And obviously, Robert De Niro as the monster is just a really bizarre choice. I kind of bought it, but I don't understand why they chose him. He was just kind of this like gruff. Well, I guess they did make Frankenstein's creature out of Robert De Niro's beggar character there. So like I forget exactly what happened, but he played that beggar or like thief or whatever, and then he died, and then Frankenstein used his body to create the monster. So I guess that's why he looks like just a Robert De Niro guy. As opposed to an actual monster. And he does have the makeup and stuff. But again, yeah, the lab isn't really over the top. It's just kind of what you would expect. I mean, obviously it's science. It's still science fiction because they didn't have any of that kind of stuff. But one scene I thought was hilarious was when he takes the monster out for the first time, and they're like wrestling with each other.
They had him almost have him stand up and then slip.
And they slip like three times and they
into the
that
goo.
And that's like so gross.
But I was like, why did that? I'm trying to. I was thinking specifically of Kenneth Branagh as the director and also the star, and what were his choices that made him say, "Yeah, let's have us try to stand up and slip 5 times in a row." I was like,
to me, that's just him being theatrical and dramatic and trying to add weight to everything. But like I said, I do think I will watch it again because just something about it worked for me, and I liked the kind of weird mystical atmosphere that it had. And then at the very end, I actually really liked that shot of Robert De Niro's monster like fading off into the distance as they sail away. But I know you were not as much of you didn't have as many good things to say about it as I do. So
yeah, this one for me, I did not enjoy. I didn't hate it, but and I say that I love Kenneth Branagh, but I think overall, yes, this didn't lean into the science fiction aspects of it. Didn't treat this as a horror movie at all. This was that's the one criticism of Kenneth Branagh is he turns everything into Shakespeare. And yes, I'm not whereas I have read Dracula by Bram Stoker. I have not read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So if this adheres more closely to the novel, that's lost on me. But yeah, I didn't care for the story just being more. It was just such a Shakespearean and maybe even almost Greek tragedy. It was just like everything that could go wrong went wrong. And I'm not a huge Robert De Niro fan anyway. We talked about this before. I feel like he's great at those sort of gangster New York tough guy, because I mean that's sort of where he's born and bred. I mean that's like almost like his natural personality. But whenever he gets cast in something that's sort of outside of that wheelhouse of gangster, or bad guy or New York person, Scorsese guy type, that he doesn't. It just doesn't work for me. And I thought that the way that they sort of tried to make the Frankenstein creature character so like sympathetic, like, okay, it was cool, like when he picked the plants for the family so that they could survive. He ultimately starts crying when Frankenstein died, and I was like, Frankenstein, he just sort of, what did he die of exhaustion at the end? He finished telling his story, and then he's just
story ended, and
I'm
he just
so
died.
Tired, and then they closed his eyes, and he's like, I'm like, he's dead? What is he?
Yeah, because there wasn't any indication that he was like injured or anything, was there?
No, it's just like, I mean, obviously he was out on the ice.
Right, well, yeah.
However the heck
but he made
there.
it that far.
Right, but I just thought that, and just the fact that the creature started crying at the end for his father, and I just was like, okay, this is just way too over the top, leaning into the Greek tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy sort of thing for me. I did think the framing story was kind of cool. Somehow that they chased each other up to the Arctic and then ran into that.
I guess that framing story is all in the book.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, that is in the book, and Frankenstein picking I think crying and learning how to talk, and I think all of that is from the book, which is I think probably where I guess it went wrong, so to speak, quote unquote wrong. Right. Whereas they were taking so many elements from the book, and whereas Dracula may lean into more like the original Dracula novel might lean more into horror. I almost wonder if Frankenstein's older than Dracula, right? I think.
Yes, yeah, much.
So I think that and the fact that they were trying to stick so closely to the novel resulted in, because I'm sure back then Frankenstein was terrifying, but I doubt it's as readable as Dracula is these days.
No,
it's probably
definitely
a lot drier, and I think that's probably where it went wrong, because I think a lot of that, like him escaping and living in the family's house for a little bit and learning how to speak from the lessons, that's all in the book. And the reason I know that is because I was watching it and I was like, what is this? This is so weird. It's not at all what I was expecting. But then I read the plot of the book and I was like, oh yeah, no, they are totally sticking to it. I think the biggest addition was kind of that weird Bride of Frankenstein plot that they shoved in at the end.
And now that you bring up the book, I wonder, they really got the Bride Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein sort of story into it. But I don't know, maybe that's in the book. Yeah,
maybe that is in the book, and they ended up making Bride of Frankenstein the original movie from that part of the book, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look into that, but I think their kind of adherence so closely to the source material is probably where it went wrong, because it's probably much more of a drier drama than...
All right, so that's a wrap on Frankenstein. Just to recap, though, so I think we're in agreement. We've got Curse of Frankenstein 1958 Hammer as number 1. The original 1931 Universal Frankenstein is number 2. And then coming in not so last for you, but very last for me, is Kenneth Branagh's 1994 Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yep, absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. Then I guess it would be time to move into the Wolfman. And I really enjoyed the original
1941, yeah. Really, I'm surprised. It's funny how Frankenstein, were they both 31 or 31 and 32? Dracula and Frankenstein. I never realized it was like almost 10 years.
Yeah, it was much later.
The original Wolfman.
Yeah, I think in between was Invisible Man and A Bride of Frankenstein as well, in between Frankenstein and Wolfman, and a few others.
I think the Mummy even was in the 30s.
Mummy. Yeah, you're right.
That surprises me that it took so long
to do
get
Wolfman.
get to the first Wolfman.
Right. But they did a great job, and this is, I think, probably my favorite of the original Universal monster pictures. You have this really great kind of everyman character in the lead. Lon Chaney Jr. plays him, and he stumbles upon a caravan and eventually a werewolf. And then after, of course, they didn't have really the technology to do a big werewolf scene, but he did beat the wolf to death behind a tree, which curses him. And then obviously chaos ensues. But yeah, no, I think this is easily the most solid from a modern day standpoint. This feels the most watchable out of all of them.
Totally
it has a very traditional story that moves along very quickly. I really, really like just the spooky atmosphere and the feeling of oppressiveness that comes through, where he's just totally alone and he's on the run and he has no one to go to. And I just love that element. It's really, really creepy. I also loved seeing Bela Lugosi in a quick kind of cameo role.
Right. I
as
didn't remember
Bela,
that he was in that. Yeah.
Almost as himself, basically. He ended up being the werewolf that Lon Chaney Jr.'s character, Lawrence Talbot, I guess, ends up killing. So that's always a fun tie-in. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the makeup effects because especially in comparison to the next film we'll talk about, Curse of the Werewolf, the werewolf makeup in the Wolfman is very, very, very good, especially for the time. But even nowadays, I think just the way the hair like lifts off his face and everything just looks really, really cool. So I think they just knocked it out of the park with this one. I really don't have anything negative to say about it, as far as I can think of. Maybe you have something that will remind me, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
This was definitely, of the three original films that we're talking about, original Universal kickoff films that we're talking about, this is definitely the best. It's the shortest. The plot, I thought, was very simplistic.
Yeah, very simple.
Very to the point. Like, when they started with, they start right out with the, the little werewolf poems and things like that. Right to Lon Chaney killing the werewolf and then getting bit himself and going down that path. And they really keep coming back to those poems throughout the film. But I thought it was like very straightforward, very to the point. And it was interesting too, just that sort of inevitability. Like there was nothing like, there was kind of a weird past between father and son. And so he was coming back a little, not even so much of a prodigal son thing. That comes up more
right
in
the
later films we're going to talk about. But just coming back to the family, there was that sense of, here's this guy, he just comes back, he reunites with his family, and then no fault of his own, he gets bitten and cursed, and it just seems like, and it's obviously the story starts out with his brother having been killed by the werewolf. And so there's not this like lineage of werewolves through the family that comes up in other werewolf stories and in one of the other films we're going to talk about. But it's just this tragic, unlucky guy. And he starts out all like cool, where he's like kind of trying to pick up his romantic interest there with his funny American lines, which was kind of entertaining. But overall, great opening scene, great ending scene. The makeup effects were tremendous. So this is just a very simple, straightforward story, very watchable again from a modern standpoint, and just a great introduction to werewolf lore.
Absolutely.
So next up, and we are back to Hammer Horror in their classic period, late 50s, early 60s, and Curse of the Werewolf from 1961. This story is very different than the original Wolfman. It's not, I don't think, that's the difference between Dracula and Frankenstein. The Wolfman story is just something cobbled together out of werewolf lore. There is no sort of...
Yeah, it's not based off of source material or anything.
Exactly, based off of any source material. So it's an interesting story. I found this to be, I can definitely say, although this will prove me objective even when it comes to Hammer films, I didn't care for this one that much. I thought it gets better as it goes along, I think, but I found the whole build-up to how this another tragic figure becomes a werewolf to be super convoluted and confusing, and like what really caused him to be a werewolf. It's this beggar and who gets thrown in jail, and then the servant girl gets thrown in with him and gets unfortunately sexually assaulted, and then she kills the evil mean baron guy, and then she gets taken in by the family and has this child, and there's really no sort of preceding, like no one got bit by a werewolf. It's just that it's just this sort of cursed child idea that causes him to turn into some beast. So the whole thing was like just so sort of convoluted how they got to this tragic character becoming a werewolf. From there, we see some interesting creepy scenes where as a kid, the full moon comes out and this kid starts to like sneak out of his room and kill some animals around the village, and he wakes up in like a cold sweat and he still has fangs. So like that, there was that scene I thought was kind of effective. And then he meets the love of his life, who maybe can save him from himself, but probably really can't. And he goes out carousing with his buddy and kills some people and turns into the werewolf, and then he gets thrown in jail, and the girlfriend tries to save him, and all this sort of convoluted stuff happens, basically, which ultimately ends up in this finale of him prowling around the rooftops of the village and eventually getting burnt up in the spire of the tower. And I don't even think he attacked anybody else. And so I actually thought the werewolf makeup was pretty good. It was, again, these movies, the three movies that we're talking about today, all really do go for that wolf-man approach of like just a man that sort of morphs into a werewolf, and they, their arms and legs and things get all sprouted out and everything else, but they don't fully become like a
full-on wolf,
full-on canine creature.
Right.
They become a wolf man. This one I just thought was, while I love the look and feel of Hammer movies, and it's got that there with the Victorian stuff and everything else, but this one was kind of disappointing, I thought.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought, the whole build up. I mean, to me, it didn't really even feel that much like a werewolf film. It's like, towards the, I guess, middle and end, when the kid starts having his little blackouts and killing and whatever else, and then obviously the end when he finally transforms into a full werewolf. But I mean, everything leading up to it felt more of just like one of those like weird period like shock value films where it's just like the evil baron aristocrat there just is so comically evil,
right?
That he's like more or less forcing the beggar there to like get really drunk and then do all this stuff, and it just felt like it just felt like really depraved. And then especially once it gets into the multiple sexual assaults and everything else, it just feels like it was just piling on all of this depravity and kind of shocking stuff just for the sake of it. Like I don't know, like Caligula or something like that. It didn't even feel like a horror movie. And then once you finally get to the werewolf stuff, I personally wasn't like terribly impressed with the makeup. I mean, it was fine, but it just kind of looked silly. And then when he's a werewolf, he's like running away from the crowd. He's not like attacking anybody or so there's not really much of a thrill there. It's almost like, why should I care if this werewolf isn't even a threat to anybody, really? Right. And then the end was kind of, I mean, obviously like the production value and I love that him climbing across the rooftops with that like midnight blue background and everything is really, really pretty. But it just as a movie as a whole, it didn't come together, and it just felt too meandering and not enough actual werewolf either lore or anything. There isn't any real explanation for why. Is it because this horrible circumstance, or was it because, what did he say, he was born on Christmas or something like that, and that was had to do with the curse? It was just like too much.
They were just grasping at straws for some sort of origin story, when it's just like, a werewolf bites another person and then they become a werewolf. Like, why don't you just go with that? It's pretty simple and easy.
So I don't think I will be watching this one again in my Halloween werewolf watch throughs, but I'm not mad that I watched it. It was fine. It was a fine movie, just didn't do much for me. And then moving on to our final film, I didn't watch for the longest time because it got such terrible reviews across the board, both from critics and audiences. So I almost was thinking it was kind of this dry period piece where the Wolfman only shows up at the very end or something like that. And so for the longest time I avoided it. And then finally watching it, it was like totally the opposite of that. It was this fun, almost like action, adventure, horror film. And I guess the production of it was a little bit troubled. I guess they had someone else directing at first, and there were some creative differences, so they fired him and brought on Joe Johnston, who did The Rocketeer and Captain America: The First Avenger, and he has this very cool, stylistic, kind of like bombastic style, filmmaking style, and I think he brought that, but then I think there was a lot of reshoots, and he ended up going over budget, and so as a result, there's this kind of middle segment in the film where I feel like they just dragged Anthony Hopkins back onto set to complete. And I don't think that, I'm not sure if that's actually true, but that's just what it feels like, because he starts almost like babbling. Like he starts going on and on and on about like werewolves and how great being a werewolf is. And it just feels kind of weird. And so I think that kind of tainted the movie for a lot of people and kind of brought it down in the middle. But everything else, I don't really understand the totally negative reception to this movie, because it's super fun, super creepy, has awesome setting.
Pretty bloody.
Super bloody, yeah, very gory, which I wonder if that might have turned other people off who were kind of wanting something closer to the more cerebral and atmospheric original. But yeah, no, it's a total just fun werewolf film with tons of great over the top violence and gore, but not to the point of it being too much. It's just like super fun. And I just think it hits that perfect level of fun and creepy for Halloween for me. And then I really just love the kind, even though it's not the most original plot, but the dynamic between Anthony Hopkins and not Guillermo del Toro, Benicio del Toro, and obviously Emily Blunt too is really good. Yeah, great cast. Hugo Weaving.
Yeah.
And the effects are kind of spotty. Like some of the CGI isn't that great, but all the practical stuff is really good, and I love the werewolf designs. And then my favorite scene is where all of the dry, crusty academics are all sitting watching him, and they're saying, "Oh, he's not going to transform," and they're all totally skeptical. And then that guy's going on and on as he transforms behind him, and then Benicio del Toro's character ends up just slaughtering the entire room as he turns into a werewolf, which I thought was really fun. So maybe not the most highbrow entertainment, but just super fun, kind of schlocky, good Halloween film in my opinion. So I then, after watching it, went and texted you and texted Dad, like, you got to watch Wolfman 2010. It's way better than I ever thought it would be. So I'm interested in seeing if you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I will say I enjoyed it. I agree with your assessment of it just being this sort of fun, action, splattery werewolf story. If they had kept it simple. It does take a lot of cues from the 1941 movie.
Yeah, a lot.
Not exactly, but a lot of cues from that movie. That was my biggest problem with it. So I agree. I would basically say I agree with all the things you said. It was great action. I thought they perfected sort of that Wolfman. There's even a little of the original Wolfman to there. And there's a little of the Hammer Wolfman in that ultimate costume design. But I think obviously they nailed it. I think from just a scary face and just overall thing. And then obviously you could do a lot more with the body with CGI now that you couldn't do with the older movies. So my biggest disconnect with this movie is just in the tonal shift, and maybe it lends itself to all that replacing the director and turmoil, because it starts out with, similar to the 1941, the older or younger, I can't remember which, Talbot's son dies, gets killed by the werewolf. Younger Talbot comes back, sort of reconnects with the father, and it's the whole prodigal son thing. And then while I did start to suspect that the father was also a werewolf, and that's where this movie, unlike the 1941, gets into this whole idea of like it's the curse comes from a family lineage of werewolves. There was sort of this sympathetic idea of like the kind of mean dad who's been through a lot, and the Lawrence Talbot's mother died tragically and all that stuff, and him and the father kind of reconnect, and then you think it's just going to go the way the original Wolfman did, which was like tragically now Lawrence gets bit and he becomes a werewolf, and there you have it. And there's and the story just goes to his inevitable unraveling into chaos and like the original Wolfman. But instead, all of a sudden there's this twist with the father turning into this really like sinister character, and he's like totally throws the son under the bus and turns him into the authorities, and he talks about all this glorification of like how he became a werewolf, and then all of a sudden he's just glorifies the being set free and killing everybody and everything, and then it becomes this werewolf versus werewolf battle at the end. And so I just was like, if they had kept it simple and I just think that plot juxtaposition, like Anthony Hopkins' character, and I think you alluded to this in your comments, just sort of totally changed. Yeah,
just like on
where he was coming from, like mid movie, and it didn't feel like. I mean, someone could say, "Oh, well, that's the twist," and like it didn't feel like a twist. It felt like this like they had one idea for how his character was going to go, and then and then there was another idea, and they just sort of smushed the two together. So that made it sort of ultimately kind of unsatisfying for me. Things I loved, obviously, the werewolf scenes. The scene of the werewolf circling the gypsy camp.
Yeah, that was cool.
That was amazing. It had that sort of, and we talked about this, and you probably know the technical aspects of it better than I do. It had that mid-2000s dark sort of Harry Potter cinematography, right. The washed out colors, etc.
Yeah, the washed out color thing is, we were talking about that while we were watching it, and that was kind of like the height of the washed out color movie craze. And
right.
and in that movie, it's tasteful, and in like the Harry Potter movies, I find it's not overdone. But then a lot of movies of that time period are just like, it's almost like watching a black and white movie. Like if you watch the Twilight movies, like all the blood and reds are like look gray, you know. And I'm not a fan of that kind of washed out look in general, because it just reminds me of that time where it was overdone. But both in this movie and just as an example, the Harry Potter movies, I think, don't overdo it. So that's kind of a tangent, but I thought it was done reasonably well in this movie, and then visually, just overall, the movie's really, really cool.
So I think it didn't deserve to get trashed as much as it did. I stayed away from it too because of that, and I'm also, Benicio del Toro, I don't think was the best.
Yeah, he was
choice.
An interesting casting choice.
I wonder if he was their first choice. Usually plays somebody with a lot of pathos or stuff going on under the surface, and it seemed like the Lawrence Talbot character should be more of an everyman. And I think that it could have been somebody who matched up better with Emily Blunt
or Emily Blunt. Oh,
I didn't see them.
Okay, yeah,
I didn't see the two of them meshing.
Yeah, their relationship felt a little bit kind of ham-fisted,
right.
Where it almost felt like she fell in love with him just because he was like looked like the brother, and he was there and everything else.
Yeah.
So that could have been developed a little bit more. But I liked her role overall in the story.
It did. It was very good. She was very good. She's great in everything. So overall, good action movie. If the plot had stayed simpler and some of those sort of crazy inconsistencies were not there, and if it was maybe a little bit shorter,
it is a little bit long. Yeah, and there is we almost consider watching the director's cut.
Oh, thank God we didn't.
Yeah, it would have been too long. I probably will end up watching it eventually, just because it's almost like 20 minutes longer, I think.
It is. Yeah.
So I would be really curious to see what more there is.
They do,
like there was so much in that movie, but yeah, it was a little bit long, but overall, yeah. In terms of, if we're going on to ranking now, I don't know if I definitely would put Curse of the Werewolf at the bottom.
Yes, me too.
But I don't know which Wolfman I prefer, and they are very different, but they also are very similar in a lot of ways too. Honestly, it's kind of a toss-up. You could put Wolfman 2010 number 1, Wolfman the original at number 1. So I don't think I want to. What is your ranking? Do you have?
I would definitely clearly put 1941 first.
Interesting. Okay.
This
well,
second,
I mean, I would agree, and I think it really would depend on the day. But I guess today, just to be different, I'll say 2010 Wolfman was my favorite, just because just the over-the-top action, and it's super fun, but also has a lot of great creepy atmospheric scenes and great performances from all the characters. So I'm gonna have to put that one on top. But on another day, it might be the original Wolfman, because it was also very good.
All right, that's a wrap on our Halloween Classic Universal Monster reviews. Join us for our next episode, where we will be diving back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We are a week away from the Eternals premiere, so we're super excited about that. Super interested to see. There's a lot of sort of interesting sort of takes and news swirling around Eternals, so we're really excited to see it. And what we'll do is we'll pair that with finishing up our review of the Disney Plus What If animated series, and finishing off our review of that. So thanks so much if you've been with us for this episode. We appreciate it. And we hope you join us next time on Worlds Beyond with Cam and Ron.
Happy Halloween, guys.